Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. Just so you know, I want to let you know in advance, we actually have a keynote with IDC coming up next, which is exciting. It also means I have to rush over to the keynote theater here right afterwards, so I won't have as much time for questions or for conversation, but if you want to come see the keynote, please come here. And then after the keynote, around 3 o'clock, I'll be over at our booth, which is number 214, if people want to have further conversations or ask questions. So I apologize that we won't have as much time for questions now. So my name is Schein. I'm Vice President of Data Curiosity at Domo. We're a cloud-based analytics platform. And today my topic is around architecting for the head and the long tail of analytics. And so I'll get to this in a little bit of understanding how do we really get to all the analytics, all the business problems that we have in an organization as we're thinking about architecture and data infrastructure. And so just quickly on myself, I have a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics, so I have no formal training in data, which is maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. And I spent 6 years at a software startup before getting my MBA at the University of Minnesota. And then I spent 10 years at Target, the US retailer, $70 billion retailer, breaking things in finance, and then going on doing data and analytics for Target.com and digital, and then for broader all of Target. And about a year and a half ago, I decided I really was ready for a break from Target, and also had this hypothesis around how do we change data culture? How do we unlock data curiosity in organizations? And approached, Okay, better, yes. So about a year and a half ago, I made the decision to come to Domo as a place to explore some of these ideas about data culture, data curiosity, and I serve under our chief technology officer, but I'm really a product and a data culture evangelist. I get to come to places like this and talk with lots of people all over the world and explore what data culture looks like, not just at a great company like Target, but different companies, different industries, different sizes, different countries and cultures, and what all that means. And so, what I want to talk about today is not software. It's not even specifically data architecture. I really want to start our conversation to talk about culture, about how data is used in our organizations, and how do we get things done as an organization. And that really, to me, is the crux of what we're trying to do and what all of us as data professionals are trying to do. And so the way that I think about it, and a lot of this aligns to sort of general agile philosophy, is that traditionally within BI, within data and analytics, we took an approach that was very focused on basic needs and sort of a checklist of requirements. Do I have these metrics? Do I have this type of visualization? Do I have, this type of query response time, which are all very important things, but it leads to this dynamic where we're just doing the minimum and we're actually pushing people out of our core systems into Excel, into Access, and we're not enabling them. And so if we want to really change culture and change the way that data is used in an organization, we need to think differently about the kinds of ecosystems we architect and what we're doing with data in our organizations. And so some of this, to me, I often talk about, I think there's a core dilemma that we all face as data professionals or as BI professionals. And it's that it just seems too hard, right? I want data to solve a business problem, and whether I'm a business person, or I'm a data scientist, or I'm a data engineer, or I'm a manager in IT, or whatever role I'm playing, it feels too hard on both sides. It's frustrating. A lot of times this goes to the business and they're frustrated it's taking too long, but it's also frustrating as a data professional to feel like I can't respond to business at the pace that it wants to and it deserves to. And so in this core, and I also think there's a lot of emotion underneath all of this, right? So people are almost traumatized from data over the years, right? They've been told something's going to work. It never works. It's always too hard. And so they've sort of shut down emotionally to accepting new data and new tools into the world they're living and to what they're trying to do. And so a lot of that pain, a lot of that emotion actually comes from a problem around prioritization and how we think about getting work done, right? So I would propose that we need to think about different frameworks for how we understand our resources, how we prioritize, and how we think about the ecosystem that helps us get to that core problem and helps us understand how data can actually help. And so the construct I would propose actually comes from this gentleman named David Hussman, who was a mentor and agile coach of mine, and he happens to look a lot like The Big Lebowski. If anyone's seen that movie, great movie. And so he actually came up with something he called Dude's Law. And I think it's a useful construct. And so what he did was he looked at other parts of science, right? So he looked at Ohm's law, which has to do with the electric current being related to the voltage and the resistance, right? And I sort of like this visualization of it because I think it also sort of summarizes that core dilemma. This is what it sometimes feels like when we're trying to get a project through and you're squeezing it and there's constraint on it, right? And so he took that dynamic that it's not just about how much power you have behind something, right? It has to do with how much resistance you have, and that is the net value. And so as David looked at this, and he looked at Dude's Law to take this to more of a business context, more of an agile context, he took that equation and said, look, value is actually equal to Y divided by the how, right? So why am I doing something? Is it important? And then how do I actually get that done? Right, and that's how we understand the value, in some ways, the amount of energy I can push through my organization. And so if I start unpacking this a little bit, what happens? Where is that frustration that comes, and where are we trying to get to all these different problems? A lot of times the how can be very big. What does that mean? It means I need lots of engineers. I love engineers. I never have enough. I need lots of investment. I need lots of time. I need lots of people. I need lots of training. All those things can grow this denominator of how. And what does that mean? That means that logically, right? And I think it's important. We have to have empathy. Like if the how is really that big, like people are making logical prioritization decisions in that ecosystem that you need a really big why. I need a really big business problem, a really big value proposition to justify so that my total value is actually positive or greater than one. I guess you could have value less than one. And how do I grow that and how do I do that? Which might be fine, right? Like you should be using math and IRR and other estimates of how you're getting value from what you're doing. The problem is that a lot of the value that I see from data insights and when I see real data curiosity and a change in data culture, it doesn't come from those big whys. It doesn't come from priority 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 at an organization because those priorities are always big enough that I can throw resources at them. I could throw engineers, I could throw more clusters, more servers, all these pieces. It comes from the tiny whys, right? It comes from the little business problem that I have around theft protection or around retiring DB2 or other things that I saw at Target where if I have this big how and I always need lots of engineers, I can't actually get to it. And so often when I hear people say digital transformation or culture change or all this, I see it and I see this big asterisk on there. Because often the asterisk is that it's only if you're working on those top 5 priorities. If I'm working on number 6 or 22 or 50, which still has value, I'm not given the how. I'm not given that infrastructure to be able to do it. So what are we trying to do? What do I believe as data professionals, as data architects, engineers, software vendors, business people we have to do? We have to try to shrink that how, right? How do we make it smaller and smaller? Because again, it's an equation, right? There's 2 halves to this equation, and you could always game metrics however you want, right? But I don't just have to find bigger and bigger Y. My value can actually exponentially increase if I start shrinking that how and allow myself to bring in more and more Ys. Those small little problems. Priority number 200 still gets enough resource to be able to go after it. And so this is where I think we start getting after this idea of the long tail, right? So I have a long history in retail, and right, the long tail often is, if you think about Amazon having this long tail of assortment, right? You have the head where most of your products and sales are, and then you sort of have diminishing sales. But so if we think about it as more with the y-axis being just the value that I get from data, and the x-axis being how many business problems I get after and what number priority is it, I start getting into this long tail because those smaller Ys can now be brought into my engine and brought into what I'm doing and how I understand things. And so to me, a lot of what I try to do in my work is, again, like that's how we make the culture shift, is we start thinking about how do we design the smaller hows, whether it's low code, no code, ways to empower people so that it's not so hard to solve your problem and you can get there. And so how do we do this, right? So that's great. It's great to have a framework, to have an equation, to have the wisdom from David to help guide me and sort of frame it for the organization. But again, it's not that we haven't been trying, right? No one, or very few people set out and say, I want an inefficient system, or I want an expensive system, or I want an inflexible system. You don't start out there. So how do we start unpacking some of the practices, some of the approaches that I've seen to build and engineer and architect in a way that helps us shrink that how and drive more value for my organization? So one thing, dynamic that I use heavily at Target, and again, a lot of this is coming out of this agile thinking around small teams, around accountability, is I always thought about the data infrastructure I was building to enable small teams so that people could feel like mini data product owners, right? And some of those people maybe were analysts, some of them were maybe business people, but I wanted to try to give them as much of the ecosystem so that they can own what's there. They can be accountable for what they're building, for what they're delivering, because they're close to the business and because, again, I can't have a ton of engineers constantly available to them because I don't have unlimited engineers. And so some of that is, it's a change in culture, it's a change in expectation, right? As much as people, like to complain about, oh, it took so long to get this index added or to get a new table, there's something sort of comforting about being able to just complain about it and not be accountable. And so we need to shift to some of that culture to say, you're accountable. That comes with a lot of freedom and great things, and it also comes with the responsibility. And I think the flip side here, what it means if I'm building a platform team with Domo or other pieces of the components, the role of that team is not to build, it's to build the community and to build the connections that allow these small product owners to operate, right? So it's things like, some things might be certified or certain more secure data sets they might have to manage, but most things are decentralized. How do I create rituals and practices, open labs, office hours, chat rooms? Right? It takes work to make sure that people are enabled in these small little mini product teams and provide that together. What's the governance and security? How do I use data, which we'll talk about a little bit, to manage what's going on out there, right? And so, again, it's a much different challenge. It's sort of a technical challenge, but it's more of a cultural challenge that if I'm going to shrink that how, empower more people, I'm going to need to have a different kind of team helping to connect those dots for the team. One piece of advice I would have as you think about some of these changes or using new platforms is really trying to understand where are the gaps and not just recreating maybe what you already had in an existing platform, right? So if you think about, I always push people to say, like, if you're doing something new, like, try to go the one extra, right? And that might mean different things for different types of data. Maybe it's one more level of granularity, one more level of latency. So instead of every hour, I'm going to do every 15 minutes, right? You need to push yourself to not just recreate the status quo, because part of this long tail of analytics is you don't know what those little business problems that are out here on the right are, right? So if I overly engineer, I overly lock into what I know, I'm not going to be able to sort of unlock all those little tiny hows along the long tail. And so I need to think about more detail, obviously working in shorter sprints or learning more quickly. How do you wow and excite people, right? I think this feels like, obviously you want to do good work. How do you take it up a level? How do you get people excited about data? And I think as I did some of this, targeted as I see it happen with our customer base, I underestimate the value of that wow on my technical resources, right? I don't usually do change to try to improve morale around my data scientists, but if they have now the ability to wow and respond and really help the business, they actually are much happier employees. They're less likely to leave, they're less disgruntled, right? And so I don't think I ever thought about that until I sort of saw some of this excitement, not just on the consumer end, but on the engineer and the creation end. And I'm a big advocate about get past cube thinking, and some of that ties into just one level deeper, right? Try not to summarize, create the infrastructure so that I have flexibility, which is then letting me unlock all these different business problems farther down the chain. Another important topic within this is the role of governance, right? So I think if you look at that original slide with the sort of the old BI approach, I think governance for a long time was about locking people down, right? So you can't do this, you can't do that, you don't have access to that. Sometimes, usually for very legitimate reasons, but that just pushed people to excel or to access or to do things on their own, right? And so how do I flip it and make governance more of an enabler? I think a couple key things are that to acknowledge the nuance of data, right? A lot of times I feel like I get in conversations and we'll talk, how do we unlock this? How do we give more people access? And then there's like, but what about this? And so a lot of times people use that as the argument to not do any of it. Well, yes, human resource data is different. GDPR data is different. We should lock that down. We need to have that siloed, but that shouldn't stop me from locking down, point of sales data. And so how do you make sure that you're acknowledging it? Because I think a lot of times it just becomes this fight between, no, you can't have the data. Yes, I want the data. And there's no in between. There has to be nuance. There's nuance to the reality of our data and laws and all these other things. I actually was talking with a new customer in the States who does cannabis. They do software for cannabis companies making marijuana. And that's a heavily regulated industry now in the place that's legal in the States. And so they don't have choice, right? There's certain things you don't have choice about, but that doesn't mean that you try to do those pieces. Just taking, and this is very much just almost a mind shift, right? That the role of governance is to enable as many people as I can, to give them the freedom to explore where they're allowed to explore. And it might even be a similar outcome, but when we take the approach that governance is about locking out and cutting people away, you forget about that inherent need and that core problem around BI, and you need to really have that framed. And I really believe that good governance, good tools, and I certainly spend a lot of time with our product teams working on these features, actually is a big piece of how you unlock culture, even though it doesn't necessarily directly tie to it. Some other sort of technical components to think about in terms of architecting from all and what I've seen. Obviously, integration platform as a service, using API, thinking about some of the parts of my job I really love is being able to talk with our data architecture teams and think about the flexibility of pipelines, right? You can't just talk about this fluffy flexibility and empowerment and all these things in isolation of the reality of pipeline, right? If you have a rigid pipeline, there's reality to that rigidity. How do I make it more flexible? How do I use new techniques? I think you have to assume that data is going to change once it's integrated, right? So you could get frustrated about that. You could wish everyone knew the exact requirements when you started. But you need to, there's going to be cleansing, there's going to be business logic, there's going to be new customers and different ways of thinking. So you have to go in knowing that. And I think the balance that I often push at is, yes, you need low code and no code to empower people. But a lot of times we end up implementing low and no code at the expense of high code, right? So we say, hey, here's this great system, but it's not going to scale. or it'll work, but only in this context. But if you wanted to integrate it with Python or with a JavaScript or other things, it won't work. And so you have to make sure that in your efforts to shrink the how and empower people, you don't create a low-code environment that locks off your existing resources and all those other pieces. And I think the other piece, in terms of this long tail and in terms of thinking about it, is sort of giving a place of honor and almost full citizenship for more informal data sources, right? Some things are just not yet structured. Whether it's something you're innovating with, a new system, something that started out just as a process improvement in a Smartsheet or Excel or in Google Sheets, and often our formalized systems just ignore those pieces, right? It assumes I always have to have everything has to come through a pipeline, everything has to go into my HDFS, everything has to go into Teradata, whatever tech stack you're using. And the reality of business is that there are informal data sources that are not informal because they don't matter, they're just where they're at. And so if we create ecosystems which can honor both of those, right? PowerPoint does this. The reason people put things in PowerPoint is because they could take your formalized data from a formalized system, and they can add some comments, and then they can bring something from a spreadsheet, and they can go change something in Excel. And so if we can create platforms that do all of this in one place, you're going to start connecting dots and giving people more flexibility around that as well. A couple other things that we find useful in our platform. One is, again, using APIs and connectors and leveraging public data. So we do a lot with NOAA data or US Census. I should have found out what's the Census Bureau called in the UK. I would be more culturally appropriate. Sorry about that. Or the weather agency, I don't know. Also having, again, this is some point and click, but I think some of the flexibility and the acknowledgement is that, we, in any organization, so, I've done some work with different consumer product packaged goods companies, you have different customers, right? And the reality is, not all customers are going to be the same. They're not the same in terms of how they sell. They're not the same in terms of what data they give you and what frequency. They're not the same in terms of the geographies they work on. And so the more that we can create ecosystems where I can change and accept that change and connect to it, the more we're going to be able to react to the reality of business. Right? We're not making these things up. This is the reality of running a business. If, as technical professionals, we don't have empathy for the reality of business, it's game over, right? People just hear blah, 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 Hadoop, blah, 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 whatever, and no, none of that. So we need to find the way to compromise and to understand how we accept change and embrace it. A few other tips for how we think about this. So if you look over there, sort of what I was talking about with different customers, right? One of these things is not like the other, right? And if we tried to say like the same algorithm or approach to that dog as the other otters, like it's just not the same. And so a lot of times I think we pretend, tech IT comes in and looks at this and says, oh, those are all the same. We have the same solution for everything. And that just makes us look stupid, right? We know that's not the same. So how do we do that? How do we blend things if we're thinking about algorithms? How do you think about configuration, right? So I like this analogy of like the sound mixer, where again, like you're still creating that core component. The person that's moving, the configuration up and down doesn't necessarily understand exactly how that works or exactly how an algorithm works. But by making it configurable, making it part of the interaction of what's going on, I have the ability to do that. I think with all of this, trying to let the data do the talking, and I'll talk a little bit more about usage data in a minute, in terms of, let data work. If it's more accurate, show that. Let the data drive what we're doing. If it's not, admit that it's not more accurate and what you're doing isn't as good and move on. And obviously, leverage what others have done, right? There's lots of great work, open source, other things. If something changes in your organization, you don't have to reinvent the wheel if there's something in open source or code out there or something in Git that you can pull in. So one other piece, and I alluded to this a couple times, is to me the idea of how do you use data to run your data, right? We often are sort of the stepchild, right? You don't You have lots of investment in data around your digital website or your production or S&OP. But really, we should use data to run. I would push my teams to run analytics like a web page. Right, so what do you do on a web page? Who's coming? Where are they coming from? Is it a repeat visitor? What are they clicking on the most? And obviously, we don't always have the same success event like a conversion on e-commerce. But if we can start looking at these pieces, start understanding who's looking at what, it really is empowering for us to know what's working and what's not. And I think a lot of times, right, a lot of the concern when you start shrinking this how and empowering more people, you end up with this dynamic. You're like, well, I'm scared. Like, why? Like, people are going to do A, B, and C, and I don't like that, or maybe they shouldn't be doing that. The challenge is people are already doing that. They're just doing it in Excel, and they're sending an email to your CEO that you don't know anything about. And so I always push people to say, like, let's build a platform where I have usage and I have metrics about who's using what, so that now they might do the same thing they're doing in Excel, but I have visibility. I have visibility to say, hey, that's a really interesting approach that we hadn't thought about that is really resonating with the CEO. Or I could say, that's a really interesting approach with an incorrect metric in it that's going to the CEO, and we need to mitigate that risk and stop that, right? But in either case, it's better than if that was just happening in a silo and I don't have visibility to it either. So just getting to some key takeaways. We might have 1 minute for questions. We'll see my handler over here, or my partner, Mark. So just key takeaways from what we've gone through. I think first and foremost, don't just change your data tools. Don't just change your data stack. And obviously, you could walk out of here, and there's a million people out there with lots of really cool tools. You could buy every one of those tools, but if you're not thinking about how does it change your culture, how are you changing how people organize around data, how are you making things that shrink that how and drive things, you're not going to get there. And once you commit to that culture change, then build the tech stack that supports the culture, right? Because it can't just be words. It can't just be, hey, I heard this great new dues law. We're going to use that to prioritize or to think about value. It has to then act upon it and have the infrastructure. And then lastly, don't be surprised by change. It's okay to be frustrated sometimes if things change, right? If it made it harder or you have to redo something. But if you go in eyes wide open, knowing that change is important, knowing that change is going to happen, you're going to be in a much better position, because the reality of any business, certainly retail, is that change is constant right now, and we need to expect it and know. So thank you all. I hope you learned something. Again, do we have 5 minutes? So I can take maybe a few questions, and again, we'll be in the keynote theater and elsewhere if you guys have more questions at booth 214.